Hi, just a quick little video today to show you some techniques in blending. We're starting with an underpainting, so this is dry paint underneath. And the first method I'm showing you is combining two wet patches of color. So I put in a wet lighter patch and a darker patch, and all you have to do is rinse your brush thoroughly in between, pat it dry on a paper towel, and then you can just lightly blend together those two areas and they'll blend fairly easily. The trick with acrylics and blending is understanding how wet or dry your paint is and how much water to use or not use and how much pressure to use. So you can see since both sides were still wet, I was able to just blend them together. Now this is the second method, and that's just blending an area that's wet into an area that's dry. So I came down into the dry area with a damp, clean brush, and with that scrubbing motion, I'm just scrubbing up into the wet area. And you can use these little cross-hatching down and then real lightly brushing across it to finish it off. The next method I'm showing you is to pick a wet color to put in between, in this case a darker and a lighter version, and I've come in with sort of a mid value. And again, using that same technique, going from the dry side into the wet with a brush that's been cleaned off and is just barely damp, and using a scrubbing motion. And you'll see I use this a lot in my videos, and it's a basic technique for blending an edge when the side next to it or underneath it is already dry. The key to all these blending techniques is to rinse your brush often and pat it dry on a paper towel until it just has a little bit of moisture in it. And as you blend, if it starts to pick up the paint underneath, you just need to stop and blend it again. Here's another area, something looking sort of like a tree, like you might be using in a landscape. And again, it was dry underneath. I'm putting a new wet color on top of that, and I want to blend some of those edges. So I rinsed my brush and I dried it off on the paper towel a little bit, and I'm coming in with that scrubbing motion to just soften up the edges. Oftentimes, when you put down a patch of paint, you want one side of it to stay crisp, the edges to stay crisp, and one side to blend. So I do this quite often. Here's another technique where I'm bringing in some wet paint in this mid value and coming on top of that with dry paint. With darker paint. So again, it's a wet on wet. And those are much easier to blend. You just rinse your brush so that you don't track too much of the paint into either side. Dry it off a little bit, and then just use a smooth uh, blending motion, and you can just really soften and blend that edge easily. The key is to work in small areas. If you want to work in a larger area, you're going to have to get a bigger brush, and you have to work quickly with acrylics. You only have a small amount of time before the paint is dry, so you can't lay in a whole sky and then try to come back and blend it, because it just won't work. Instead, work in these small patches. Again, coming in from the dry side, blending up. You can vary the amount of water that you use in order to take off more of the paint. Um, and you can also come back in with a paper towel and sweep off a little bit of the excess paint if you want to do that. But the basic technique that you use here is this scrubbing technique from the dry side into the wet side, and then coming back very lightly and smoothing it out. You can see that I'm using just sort of not a really soft synthetic brush. It's not like you'd use for watercolor, but it is softer than a bristle, and those are good for blending and smoothing in areas like this. So you can see you have a little bit of open working time, a little bit of time to work with your edge until you get it just the way you like it. Coming back again, showing you another method of wet into wet. I've got one area of the dark that I want to leave those edges, and then I've got an area above it, and I want to blend the edges in between. So rinsing the brush, blotting it on the paper, and then smoothing out the areas in between. That's pretty self-explanatory. I use this a lot when doing foliage in a tree. You'll often have one area of the foliage that is kind of smooth and blended, and then you want just a few little edges to peek out to look like little bits of leaves, but you don't want polka dot areas like so what you do is you lay it down like I have here, and you have these polka dot areas, but now you can come back in and soften one of the edges down. Clean brush, just damp from the dry side into the wet side, and you can just smooth a little bit as you go. This is part of a class that I've got on my website, paintwithkarenalari.com, and you're welcome to join us there and learn a little bit about blending and using acrylics to their best abilities, and hope to see you there. Thanks for joining me.